Yeah, okay. Good afternoon. Please stop talking now. I'm happy that so many of you could make it today possible to come here to Architekturhaus Salzburg. I would like warmly welcome you here at the house and a special warm welcome to Jack Halberstam. He's here. Hi. For those who don't know me, my name is Roman Höllbacher. I'm the director of this house, of the Initiative Architektur and the Architekturhaus Salzburg. And I will accompany you throughout the afternoon. I would like to thank all the speakers who came to our wonderful city of Salzburg, and I hope you enjoy your stay here. Further on, I want to say thank you to all our partners of this research festival. I'm really happy that the symposium takes place here at the Architekturhaus, and therefore, and for the whole collaboration, a big thank to Sophie Goltz, she's the mastermind of the festival, to Carolina Radenkovic from Galerie 5020, Nick from Magazine 53a, den Kunstverein, der Hosi, to Eleonora, and especially to Nico Weiss, who represents the Chamber of Architects and Engineers. The cooperation between these heterogeneous institutions with partly very different backgrounds is happening in this form for the first, and I hope not for the last time. I think it's a positive sign in a time when the world seems to be falling apart. More of this kind of cross-border collaboration will be needed. Before we start with the first panel, just some useful information. Between the panels, we will have breaks, up to 50 minutes for some refreshments, taking a coffee, or attending the toilets, which are here on my left side, on your right side. But if you would like to take a coffee in between, don't feel disturbed and take a coffee behind at the bar. Nina will help you. She's our lady at the bar. She's also an artist, a great paintress. Now we come for the first panel on non-conformist practices in architecture with S.E. Eisterer and Sergio Villanueva, Preston. It will be chaired by Sophie Goltz. I would like to introduce her. Sophie Goltz is a curator and educator based in Vienna and Berlin. She's a member of the working group Queer Spaces, which organizes Wild Things and is currently working on the monograph Architectures of the Public, How to Curate a City. It is a reflection on 45 years of public art history in Hamburg, forthcoming from Spectre Books in fall 2025. A reader titled Soft Histories, Holding Queer Memory, it's the working title, is scheduled for publication in 2026-27. And together with a collective, she is exploring the globalization of art and the rise of anti-Semitism in a research project. Dear Sophie, I would like to give the word now to you. Please, it's your turn.
So we're coming, SE, we're here. Just quick, here you are, good. So also a warm welcome from my end. We have a slight change of plan that our friend and colleague from Princeton, SE, is not with us today. And I will tell in a minute why. So a warm welcome to you, SE, because you can't see the rest, but you will see them later. How do we do this now? Yep. yeah, so. And I have the pleasure now to introduce you to our panel with Sergio and SE. It's in a way kind of a, one could say, queer family meeting, sharing questions over some time now. So because Sergio is a postdoctoral research fellow in the unit of SE Eisterer at Princeton University. And now I have the pleasure to introduce you to SE Eisterer. She's an assistant professor at the School of Architecture and a co-director in Media and Modernity at Princeton University. Currently, she is also the director of research for the Princeton Yellow Initiative and a visiting fellow at the Center for Research in Feminist, Queer, and Transgender Studies at University of Pennsylvania. Her work focuses on spatial histories of dissidence, resistance art, and feminist, queer, and trans theory in architecture. Her book, In the Daylight of Our Existence, Architectural History and the Promise of Queer Theory, will be out in the summer of 25. She also has a forthcoming book on Austrian architect and resistance fighter Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky. SE's work on the Brenning Circle, which you could see for those who were already in the exhibition. So basically the part of the exhibition that is related to the Brenninger Kreis is based on her research and, as Ron was saying, her mastermind. So the work on the Brenninger Kreis was important for the framing of the exhibition, and she will present a paper entitled Artifacts of Resistance from the Archive of Socialist Polyamory. And now, unfortunately, she can't be here with us today since her work on visa status make leaving the US at this moment challenging, so she decided to stay in the US. And a warm welcome to Sergio Preston. He is a presidential postdoctoral research fellow at Princeton University. He holds a PhD in art history, in the history of architecture and urban development from Cornell University, with a minor focus on feminist gender and sexuality studies, with a methodological approach that synthesizes feminist, trans, queer, and decolonial theories. Sergio's current research considers the domestic lives of queer families during the interwar period in Europe and the United States, examining the relationship between unconventional family arrangements and modern architecture. His paper is entitled Villa Kenwin, Queer Domesticity at the Borderline. Welcome both. SE with us online here on Zoom and Sergio here in the room. And we start with SE and her lecture.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophie, for this kind introduction. Before I move to the formal part of my presentation in just a second, I want to take the time to thank Sophie Goltz, Niklas Kogel, and Karolina Radenkovic, alongside Nico Weiss at the Chamber of Architects, as well as the staff at the Gallery 5020 and the Chamber of Architects overall for the wonderful symposium and the exhibition they've put together. And my presentation today, as Sophie already mentioned in the introduction, is kind of a narrative fabric of a part of the exhibition that has been curated by Sophie, Niklas, and Karolina. But it's really different actually to see the images and many more that I will present here in the show. So I would really warmly like to encourage everybody to go. I think it's a really important contribution to thinking about queer life in Austria. I also want to warn you that there are a lot of Austrian last names in this presentation, and some of them sound so similar that sometimes they even confuse me still. But I do think there are a couple of people I would like you to keep track of. So first, there's the architect Herbert Eichholzer, the artist Axel Leskoschek, and then although this person is kind of just a side figure in the narrative today, there is the business person Erich Kastner, who was part owner of the largest department store in Austria before it was sold to non-Jewish relatives. Actually the husbands of the sisters, to avoid the forceful usurpation by the National Socialist regime in 1937. And I would also really like for you to remember Anna Neumann, one of the 4 Feuerlöscher siblings, whose house in Brenning in the rural area around Deutsch-Feistritz, near the Styrian capital of Graz, was the home to the so-called Brenninger Kreis or Brenning Circle, a loose group of artists whose work, life, and resistance practice form the center of the talk today. So I will start my presentation now, and I'm very, very thrilled to be in conversation with Sergio at the end of our shared presentations. Okay, please just let me know if you can see my screen and if everything is coming out correctly. Can somebody let me know if it's
yes,
showing
yes,
correctly?
it's good, it's good. Do you hear us?
Okay, great. Yep, I do. So I will start the formal part of the presentation now. Despite its historical distance, among the many pictures I gathered over the years, this photo always felt familiar. Almost as if I had known it before I first saw it. The photograph shows 5 people sitting, lying, lounging in sun chairs on the lawn in front of an industrial building. The waters in the large natural pool at the center of the image are dark and reflective. The lawn dotted with white hydrangea bushes. A tinge of sepia, the paper of the photograph itself, spells late afternoon summer, but it could be late spring or high season as well. If you hold your breath and sit completely silent, you can almost hear the subdued voices of 5 people across the pool. You may even be able to feel it, lying stretched out flat in the grass on a towel, eyes closed, warm skins next to each other. Yet, at the edge of the picture, or in the waters, you might also sense quiet unease, changing times. Since the early 2000s, historians have written about the people who retroactively labeled constituted the Brenninger Kreis or Brenning Circle because of the ways in which they mounted resistance against the Nazi regime between Vienna, Graz, Zagreb, Belgrade, and Istanbul, as well as Tel Aviv in the period between 1933 to 1945. Their resistance artifacts have been discussed in such volumes as Moderne in dunkler Zeit, Modernism in Dark Times, including the work of artist Axel Leskoszek's The Ghost of Violence. And I will say a few words about the resistance artifacts that have been written about now, and this is really the most difficult part, perhaps, of the presentation. Part of a surrealist series, Leskoszek's allegorical painting records the cruelty of guards he and architect Herbert Eichholzer experienced in the Austro-fascist internment camp Wöllersdorf after the violent overthrow of Austria's First Republic in 1934. Although not a faithful rendering of reality, it captures the landscapes of internment as one core facet of resistance art. Leskoszek inscribed into the painting a closeness to nature and a reality that lies only behind barbed wire and is entirely inaccessible to the prisoners. Their everyday life is determined by the guards and who are ungraspable figures, ghost guards. Elsewhere, I've shown that one of architect Eichholz's drawings from internment in 1943 similarly constitutes a speculation beyond the carceral. Rather than Leskoszek's surrealist documentary art, here creativity allows, if only for a moment, an imagined glimpse into a possible domesticity of home, a view into a future Eichholzer already knew was foreclosed to him. Drawing from a prison cell 6 weeks before his execution by the Nazi regime, Eichholzer kept designing. In one rare case, he devised plans and projected illustrations for a family home for his parents in Graz. Architectural historian Anna Antje Sennerselt has pointed to the building's plan's deliberate modern aesthetics as an act of last defiance against the Nazi regime. Following art historian Pnina Rosenberg, I argued that this type of planning in conditions of internment can act as an inscription of agency, as a continuation of life that exceeds biological reproduction. Yet what has been and remains the most written about resistance artifact in the realm of the Brenninger Kreis is the anti-fascist leaflet publicizing the mass murder of people with disabilities at the hospital at Steinhof in Vienna. From Steinhof, 3,200 people were killed in gas chambers at Hartheim, close to the city of Linz, and 3,700 died after 1942 by neglect and starvation. Between 1941 and 1945, 70,000 people with disabilities were killed in Nazi Germany in what today is still euphemistically called euthanasia programs. The leaflet is the only document known today that openly criticized the mass murder of disabled people in Austria. Typeset by the artist Karl Drews and the factory workers Josef Neuhold, Gertrude Heinzel, and Franz Weiß, it was printed with the assistance of Herbert Eichholzer and his siblings Herbert Feuerlöscher and Anna Neumann. What was crucial for the connection between Drews, Neuhold, Heinzel, and Weiß was the Feuerlöscher cardboard factory in Brenning, where the group of Styrian artists worked in clandestine communist resistance with workers. In this paper, I focus on Brenning from the 1920s to mid-1930s, when the group produced less studied artifacts of resistance that are useful for contextualizing the later work of overt open resistance. So what's important in this paper is I will say a little bit about the resistance artifacts that lead to this period in this paper. In this process, I argue artistic work overlapped with communal life and was deeply informed by socialist ideals that rejected the bourgeois family as a fundamental unit for both production and reproduction. In fact, it was the resistance artifacts from the earlier period that I wanted to discuss when I arrived at a parking lot in Graz behind an industrial building in the spring of 1924. What had brought me to Graz was a ringing sensation about chronology that had nagged me throughout my research. I had never been able to resolve in the prior months a succession of things. No matter how I twisted and turned it, I could not sensibly align the romantic relationships within the Brenning circle. These romantic couplings and decouplings mattered in part because historians had done their best to not make them overlap, even when they know they did. The conundrum I had come to pose was a delicate one. Had architect Eichholzer used what I considered his sexuality in resistance labor to enlist multiple women to complete tasks such as sending messages, making contacts with others, copying messages, and so forth. After decades of scholarship of how women had used their quote-unquote charms and quote-unquote attractiveness and, in fact, sex in resistance endeavors, famously known in the resistance in France, I was hoping that the question would not ruffle any feathers. The gallerist and historian who was sitting across from me in the art repository and storage space in Graz was one of the most knowledgeable people about the group. I was nervous about the question I was about to ask because from a decade and a half of doing research in Austria, I was acutely aware that the safeguarding of legacies and people is a through line in the country's historiography. I know that by 1941, the architect Herbert Eichholzer was involved with Anna Neumann in Graz and that she ran errands delivering messages in clandestine work, I began. But I'm also aware that at the same time, I'm also aware that at the same time, Eichholzer collaborated with Chilean architect Victoria Maya in Austria, and that they too had a relationship. From interviews with Maya's daughter, I know that Eichholzer and Maya regarded each other as family, and so did Neumann, who cared for Eichholzer's memory in the post-war years. I took a deep breath and uttered to the gallerist. So in light of all this, after decades of writing about how women use their sexuality in resistance labor, could you or would you say that Eichholzer too used his sexuality in clandestine work? I will tell you now that I will only get to the gallerist's answer in conclusion. Yet at this point, it might be necessary to establish, at least in broad strokes, what constituted the Brenning Circle's overall work, and especially the collaborations in the 1920s and 30s. Although they were never delimited as a collective group of artists, the circle of friends from Graz that regularly gathered in Brenning around the Jewish Feuerlöscher family, especially the four siblings, Herbert, Anna, Lily, and Eva, included. The Feuerlöscher siblings themselves, especially Lily and Herbert, worked hard in their father's cardboard business, especially as the 1930s progressed. Anna was the social center of the sibling group, as well as the large circle of friends. Among them was the painter and sculptor Leskoschek, whose allegories of Wöllersdorf have already been mentioned. The editor and later screenwriter Kurt Neumann married Anna Feuerlöscher in the early 1930s. The architect Anna Lylia Simidov, Leda Braun, worked independently and alongside Eichholzer. Author and editor Ernst Fischer, whose later Marxian analysis of art history in Was Marx wirklich sagte, Marx in his own words, laid the foundation for British art historian John Berger's foundational book, Ways of Seeing, in the post-war period. But Fischer had already made a name for himself, writing and editing in the 1920s. Other regulars in Brenning were the graphic artist Walter Ritter and the businessman Erich Kastner, who was part owner of the prominent Jewish department store Kastner and Oehler in Graz. Overall, those who frequented the house in Brenning had relatively bourgeois upbringing. Although Eichholzer, Leskoschek, and Ritter came from conservative households, Simidov had grown up in a liberal Jewish environment, and the Feuerlöscher's father was also Jewish. In 1937, Kastner's share of the largest department stores in Austria, as well as the Oehler families, was sold to the non-Jewish relatives, as I stated in the introduction, the husbands of Kastner's sisters, to avoid the forceful usurpation by the National Socialist regime. Today, literary, art, and design historians have recognized the individuals in the group for their emphasis on advancing modernism in Graz and Styria, especially in the 1930s. But little has been said about the vast scale of collaborations and collaborations across media and artistic fields that the circle completed. Important commissions included Eichholzer's design for the Kastner and Oehler department store, as well as the crowning 1937 Haus Albrecher Leskoschek, which you see here. Together, Anna Lylia Braun and Eichholzer completed the interior design for the 1932 renovation of Kastner's apartment in Graz. But already by the mid-1920s, Fischer, Leskoschek, and Kurt Neumann collaborated frequently on artistic projects, including the Styrian social democratic newspaper Arbeiterwille, where their writing and art illustrations went hand in hand to mobilize Austrian intellectuals for political struggle. And I'm going to give you a bit of a taste of what the writing by the mid-1920s looked like. As Arbeiterwille's editor-in-chief, Fischer wrote cultural columns on literature, theater, and the arts, as well as short political essays, such as his 1925 Krieg dem Bürger, or War Against the Bourgeoisie. In this short text, Fischer called upon young people, quote, from the lap of bourgeois society to become useful alongside working class people in the fight against capital. Quote, we, the lost sons of the bourgeoisie, breathe deeply the blissful, bright, ozone-rich air of revolution, he wrote. The experience of this fresh breath allows us to fraternize with the working class, which from the gaggling blight of dart factories, from the humid clutches of stinking cellar holds, from the brooding abysses of lack of culture, has entered the atmosphere of the future, of fate, of history, end of quote. Accompanied by a woodcut by Leskošek, Fischer warned artists and intellectuals specifically to put their brain power in services of large industry, writing, quote, each group found a university professor, a lyricist, or a journalist who produced the ideal advertisement for their canons, end of quote. These calls directly describe the mood of a cohort of young, educated social democrats who counted themselves among a revolutionary socialist faction within the party and who sought to break away from the traditional life of their bourgeois parents. Collaborations such as that of Fischer and Leskošek were not uncommon among the writers, graphic artists, and designers 10 years later either. Between 1936 and 1937, Leskošek prominently incorporated his mural Allegory of Friends in Eichholz's design for the home of Hermann Albrecher, and a year before, Anna Neumann, often at the center of social endeavors, collaborated with Ritter and Eichholzer on a series of so-called Klump toys, wood blocks that were perhaps best expressed by their contemporary, the architect Joseph Frank, who insisted that pluralism was the hallmark of modern life. Curator and art critic Sophie Goltz has also argued in the exhibition Wild Things that at the commencement of fascism in Austria, the Klump toy series can be read along the lines of Noah's Ark. And in fact, it's drawn as such in the Allegory of Friends. Importantly, however, the group's vision was not one of abandonment of the sinking world, but one that stayed always close to the Styrian landscape. And here's another photo that the New Year's greetings for 1936 double down on this kind of vision of modernism. In turning to photos of the period, one is perhaps struck by the conviviality and lightness at the gatherings in Brenning and the Feuerlöschers hunting lodge high above Deutsch Feistritz. Many parties at the Albrecher Leskošek house, including the architect Clemens Holzmeister, who you see here in the background, allow insights into the omnipresent life of the group, but some also show the relationships with animals among the young people, and in fact, how the group related to children carried on the shoulders of adults, perhaps parents, who were not necessarily their own. Well, said the gallerist, without much hesitation, I think the group had absorbed the writing of Wilhelm Reich on sexuality at the time. If you wanted to talk about that, I mean, the other historians have told me not to mention it in our books. I think they saw the rejection of the family, in specific the model of the nuclear family, as part of socialist struggle. I paused for
instabil, kann man nichts machen. So, dann muss noch hoch. Sergio, can you text her and say maybe that she also shortens a bit? So we are back.
Hello.
We lost you for a moment.
Oh, yeah.
But it's okay.
What was the last thing you saw this?
The answer of the gallerist.
Yeah. This one was the last one we saw.
Okay, I'm sorry if I'm now repeating something, but I will go back a little bit.
So no, this is fine. We got it with the children. This is where we stopped, basically.
Okay. So, well, said the gallerist without much hesitation. I think the group had absorbed the writing of Wilhelm Reich on sexuality of the period. If you wanted to talk about it, I mean, the other historians have told me not to mention it in our prior books. I think they saw the rejection of the bourgeois family, in specific the model of the nuclear family, as part of socialist struggle. I paused for a second and carefully thought about if I could push to ask further. So, do you mean what we would call polyamory today? I will tell you now that if you're looking for definitive answers, this text might disappoint you. But in the months after the interview, I found traces of something that can perhaps be shared as fragmentary writing. In fact, I encountered in the most unlikely places of all, architectural archives, that is, and in a close reading of buildings that had already been amply studied, as well as drawings of spaces, some partial views into the landscape of friendship, familial bonds, and love that enveloped those in Brenning. Indeed, not in the Feuerlöscher estate in Brenning, where parents and visitors were always near, but in the forested cabin in the midst of the mountain regions above der Schweistritz, I found a glimpse of and beyond the communal. If the group had practiced modes of co-authorship in various built and printed projects, it was particularly in the pages of the cabin's guest book that drawings and writing revealed a true mutuality of shared life. For the informed reader, the often humoristic depictions of life in Brenning and the forest beyond become legible as depicting the relationality of persons, including commentary and inside jokes, as well as puns in Austrian dialect. Hüfe, Hüfe. In the guest book, Leskoschek, Eichholzer, Walter Ritter, and others also rendered each other, how they lived, how they moved, and how they stood tall in the world. The drawings, although often sparse in detail, provide glimpses into shared activities, skiing, for example, and their shared love for animals, playing cards, as well attended and legendary New Year's festivities that occasioned them all to camp out in the lodge in the midst of the never-ending snow. Although the rendering of the scene of New Year's morning of 1932-1933 is for me one of the most important clues about the group's communal life, you would be mistaken to think to find here the proof of polyamory. Rather, the image shows familial love, Herbert Feuerlöscher, not Eichholzer, with his sisters Annie on the left and Lily on the right. But there's the extended family too, Leskoschek, Ritter, and the animals, cows who are looking in and dogs who are looking out. In aggregate, the guest book's drawings illuminate a view of communal life that is familial and that can stand to be theorized from contemporary queer perspectives, including Jack Halberstam's notion that, quote, queer uses of time and space develop in opposition to the institutions of nuclear family, end of quote. Traces of an even more expansive vision of life and perhaps family and more than coupled bonds, to use a term by gender and sexuality studies Kim Tall-Bear, are revealed in the drawing The Architect by Herbert Eichholzer. Exhibited at the Museum Johanneum in Graz in 2002, the drawing is now inexplicably lost. It depicts a day in the life of an architect, rendering the facets of the more metropolitan life in Graz and Vienna of young people in the early 1930s. The drawing captures the architect's workload. Eichholzer himself here sits atop of the drawing, his long legs sticking out from the office table. On the phone, he makes use of the new affordances of communication, sketching while drawing. On the right, he dreams or takes part in omnipresent ski tours. At the opera, stuffy perhaps, the busy modern urbanite yawns, but the nights that are really filled and speak to kind of young life, emerge with music and wine, coupled and uncoupled. As I looked over the drawing with eyes, with a few days later with the gallerist, I finally asked, quote, so did those include homosexual relationships as well? And here's the thing. The story ends like these cases often end, in court or out of court, or in this case, as something that never went to court. Because there are living people involved, I can only leave it with what the gallerist was willing to share. That is, when one of the people in the group carried a son to term, there were 3 men who could have made plausible fathers: an architect, a businessman, and an artist. Although traces of paternity deliberations at the time do not exist, the gallerist knew that it was the architect who designed a home for the child, the owner of the department store provided the funds, and the artist gave the child a name. In the Eichholzer archive, there's one photo of that child at age 5. But much later, in the 1990s, the non-Jewish owners who had, quote unquote, legally been sold the department store in 1937 and thus never had to restitute, wanted to know nothing of a child that perhaps would have been a direct descendant of a persecuted, expelled, and murdered Jewish family. And this is perhaps where the histories I care most deeply about intersect. As a coda, I want to note with emphasis why the intersections of these histories matter. When I found a drawing by architect Margarete Schüttli-Hotzky, who was also a loose ally of the group, this for a post-war renovation of the Feuerlöscher house, I was perhaps naively hoping to find stories of community in the home where the siblings Herbert, Annie, Lily, and Lily lived until they died. And I would not want to minimize the ways in which familial living in more advanced age defies in so many critical ways histories and stories about nuclear families, ableism, and more. But the ones living in the house next to the cardboard business that folded in the 1970s could never recover any semblance of the communal life that shaped their youth. Rather, in the house, although Leskošek visited often and died there in the 1970s, the elders carried silences with them, the memory of the execution of their friend Herbert Eichholzer, the exile of Annie's first husband Kurt Neumann, which became permanent life in California, and the absences of all their friends from the Kastner family. Moreover, in thinking with trans scholar Xavier Nunn, who studies how the erasure and the legal frameworks created under the Nazi regime transcended into the post-war period, I sometimes also wonder if the totalizing erasure of queer and trans lives, as well as that of polyamorous family from the record of architectural history, lives that were thinkable actually in the 1920s and 30s, sits with us today. That is to say, these erasures are ongoing and they mutate through culture, economy, and the law into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, SE. We're now coming to Sergio. Voila. If you need this, you can take this.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking for my document. Hi, thanks. Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for having me. I'll leave it there. Thank you. So let me see. Yeah, lovely, thank you. Can I make a little space for this guy? Thanks, perfect. Great, so the house I'll be speaking about today is called Via Kenwin. It was built in 1931 on the shores of Lake Geneva, outside of Montreux. And Via Kenwin was designed and occupied by a queer family made up of 3 adults in a bisexual open relationship and their daughter. And I'll talk about them more, the family, in much more detail in a moment. But this threesome formed the nucleus of an international arts collective called the Pool Group. And so I'll refer to this trio throughout the presentation as the Pool Group. Via Kenwin had to subvert normative spatial practices in order to serve and to justify this non-normative family arrangement. And it had to both accommodate and camouflage, I argue, this queer family. And as a note, in this presentation, I'll mostly be using contemporary photographs because when it was built, it was originally intended to have this color scheme, but during the time of its construction, there was so much pushback from the neighbors that this color scheme wasn't implemented until it was bought in the 80s by a different architect and renovated according to the original plans. So if there's some discrepancy in the photos I show, the archival photos aren't colored, but the more contemporary ones are. And I'll do this really quickly for the sake of time, but Via Kenwin has a really complicated kind of architectural parentage. It was originally sketched by Alberto Sartoris here on the left. This was found in the possession of the Pool Group. It's not really known what their relationship was with Sartoris or where the drawing came from, but it was clearly the basis for the further development by he was a German art director working in set design in the German film industry named Alexander Ferenczi. He took on a young Hermann Henselmann as an apprentice during this project. Ferenczi died in a car accident during construction, and Henselmann finished the project and was attributed by the Pool Group especially as the sole architect. So there's a bit of an erasure about who the architect, the more complicated architectural parentage. Henselmann is usually attributed with the project, even though clearly the development was more complicated. Via Kenwin, did not, that got loud. Via Kenwin did not cleanly fit into the more traditional Swiss architectural styles or context. Via Kenwin's neighbor, who was a doctor living in a neoclassically styled home, complained to the municipal council about the home's design and its use of color. And this complaint started years of delays and deliberations with the municipal council, writing at one point, quote, that this project of purely Germanic ultra-modern design evokes in the mind more the idea of a kind of rabbit cage than that of a pleasure house in the countryside, a villa. But to understand Via Kenwin, I think it's most important to understand its owners rather than to understand the architects. The owners were deeply involved in its design, working closely with both Ferenczi and Henselmann to make drawings that fit their lives. As I mentioned earlier, the Pool Group was this broad international collaboration of artists, writers, and filmmakers. At the center, though, was this trio, this three-way relationship between the American poet H.D., here on the left, the writer and arts patron Breyer in the center, and the Scottish artist and film director Kenneth McPherson on the right. Each of them individually is fascinating. H.D. was engaged to Ezra Pound as a young woman. She was the figurehead of the Imagist poetry movement. She was a student and analysand of Freud's. And it's relevant to mention Breyer, her birth name was Winifred Ellerman. She was the daughter of Sir John Ellerman, who was a shipping magnate and the richest man in Britain at the time. And Kenwin is a combination of the first three letters of McPherson's name, Kenneth, with Breyer's birth name, Winifred. Breyer was a writer and considered herself an educator. She was a major patron of the arts. And she, to her friend Havelock Ellis, she wrote that she always considered herself a boy trapped in a girl's body. So it's not clear if maybe in today's language she might have considered herself a trans man, or if that was her way of speaking about this inverted, the framing of lesbian sexuality as an inversion. And years after the period I'm describing, Kenneth McPherson has a really sort of deliciously gossipy set of relationships in New York, including a sort of sexually unfulfilling relationship with Peggy Guggenheim. He would get drunk at parties and they would both talk about how unhappy they were. Phenomenal. He also dated a star of the Harlem Renaissance named Jimmy Daniels, who had been Philip Johnson's first boyfriend. So there's really a lot there that I think is worth exploring in a different talk. And I'll also leave this. Borderline is probably their best known project. It was a silent film. It dealt with issues of queerness and race. It was going to be, it's in the title of the talk. I was going to go into more detail about it, but I think I'll leave it aside for now, just for the sake of time. In any case, so the relationship between H.D. Breyer and McPherson was complicated, but to make it even more complicated, H.D. also had a daughter named Perdita, from an affair with a man who was not her husband. In order to protect Perdita legally, Breyer, who was a lesbian, married McPherson, who was bisexual, in 1927, while both maintained an open relationship with H.D. And this idea, sometimes called of lavender marriage, when queer people would marry in order to pass as straight, was not uncommon. McPherson, in fact, was Breyer's second husband. And this is maybe too delicious to pass up, but Breyer was originally married to someone named Robert McAlmon, and when they divorced, she left him with such a large amount of money that in Paris he was known as Robert McAlimony, which is so funny. Like most women at the time, H.D. and Breyer weren't allowed to travel unchaperoned as single women. So they were required to use other familial identifiers. They would claim to be sisters or cousins, or they would evoke their status of wives even when their husbands weren't around. Breyer's mother and very rich father hated Breyer's relationship with H.D., and they gave her this extravagant house as a wedding gift when she married McPherson. It was a reward, perhaps, for returning to the heteronormative fold. Then the Pool Group was this unconventional family for nearly 100 years ago, and I think it still looks pretty unconventional today. The house had to account for this unconventional arrangement while seeming to align with normal conventions. It did this, I think, in two main ways, which I want to explore through this quote by Perdita. As an adult, Perdita was reflecting on this relationship between H.D. and Breyer. She wrote, "I had two mothers. The real one, whom I called Mama, and the other one, Breyer. They were always together, those two. H.D., tall and dreamy. Breyer, short and purposeful, austere, with close-cropped hair and tailored suits. Ces dames, the Swiss neighbors called them. Des écrivains, it was rumored, which accounted for a lot." So this passage is telling, and it frames how I want to analyze the architectural nonconformity of Via Kenwin. Perdita's quote highlights, I think, H.D. and Breyer's position as women who were ostensibly sisters, cousins, wives, and as writers. Via Kenwin operates, I think, on both of these sort of identity categories to help camouflage their queer family arrangement. within normative, familial, and professional terms. So if you ignore the details of their private lives, I think the fact that Breyer and Macpherson are married, they've adopted a child, and they share a marital home reads successfully as heteronormative. But the layout of the house also supported unusual domestic conditions. The bedroom here on the upper floor, for example, are almost startlingly egalitarian. None of the bedrooms prioritize a central reproductive couple. Instead, all of the rooms are basically equal and individual, with none being privileged in terms of size, privacy, or amenities. Via Kenwin is not a marital home. In other words, it is something of a headquarters for the pool group, allowing for an international network of friends and collaborators to visit and stay, not as spatially marginalized guests, but as equals. As Perdita said in the passage above, they're being considered writers also who accounted for a lot, providing justification for their otherwise eccentric domestic arrangement to their more traditional Swiss neighbors. In other words, their legibility as workers helped justify an otherwise illegible family life. Beyond writers, there are also filmmakers, and Via Kenwin was meant to accommodate their role as filmmakers. Henselman called this large central room on the sort of the main floor the studio, and he said it was the core of the house. So this grand central space was originally also intended for filming, but two things stopped them. The first is that the local authorities were concerned that this mixture of cinema and domesticity indicated the space was going to be used to film pornography. And secondly, the pool group's films used a visual language and the art of montage to tell what they considered to be universal human stories. Film at the time was beginning to incorporate speaking, and they believed that the specificity of language robbed the film of that universal visual quality, and so they stopped making them. Kenneth Macpherson loved collaborating on the house design so much that he decided he wanted to leave film and become an architect, but that never happened. He moved to New York and dated Peggy Guggenheim instead. So if you can see, this is on the right, this is the large central space. Up above, there's an opening. There's a filming room up there, a screening room for films. And HD often sat on that small balcony overlooking the space to write. So beyond reimagining the relationship of the house to the family and domestic labor, the pool group also, I think, had an expanded sense of what can constitute kinship. Their various animals were woven quite affectionately into their lives. This slide is of Macpherson's monkeys, which he made a film about in, oops, I'm so sorry. No, I've gone too far. I'll make this quick, but I think another thing that makes HD and Breyer really interesting is that they're woven into the kind of canon of queer theory. Adrian Rich wrote about both of them as a kind of model for lesbian community, to the degree in which they supported each other. It was the basis for two of her essays, one called Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence, written in 1980, and the other called Conditions for Work, The Common World of Women, written in 1976. So the fact that this house allowed for a kind of co-supportive work amongst these women, I think is an indicator that it was performing atypically, but I think importantly in a queer theory history. Here are the monkeys. So yeah, I think beyond kind of reimagining what a family dynamic would look like, the house also included a kind of more complex extra-human kinship. These monkeys were the subject of one of Macpherson's films, and early drafts of the house included a large cage for them on his desk. Unfortunately, they both died before the house was completed. But interestingly, I think during World War II, Breyer negotiated with the Zurich Zoo to house their elephant in Via Kenwin's garden due to concerns of a Nazi invasion. And it's probably better that that never happened. But even in the early stages of the relationship, during their first conversation, the kind of intimacy between HD and Breyer started because Breyer promised to take HD to see puffins. And Breyer also had a lot of dogs, and what I'm trying to express is more than that they had a lot of animals or a love for animals. Their entire vocabulary of affection is told through the language of animals. In their private letters, their nicknames for each other were literal pet names. Macpherson was called Rex or Rover. HD was called Horse or Cat. There was a quality of domestic animality that crept into their love letters that structured their affections for each other. Perdita would curl up with HD like a kitten. They would write about wagging their tails off with excitement to see each other and referring to themselves collectively as the menagerie. And these nicknames may have been a way of obscuring their relationships to each other in writing, a kind of editing that allowed for plausible deniability. But I think it might also mark new ways of considering relationships that include non-human life. And this perspective, I think, is strengthened if we examine how Via Kenwin positions itself in relation to its immediate environment. So I want to consider this sketch by Le Corbusier as a point of contrast. Here we have Rio de Janeiro, in which Corbusier identifies Rio's natural splendor. He stops in front of it, and he installs his armchair. Crack, he writes, the four obliques of a perspective. Your room is installed before the sight. The whole sea landscape enters your room. The pact with nature has been sealed. By means available to town planning, it is possible to enter nature in the lease. In her analysis of this passage, Beatrice Colomina writes that the perspective created by the frame of the house domesticates the overpowering landscape. And she writes that for Le Corbusier, it is in fact this domestication of the view that makes the house a house, rather than the provision of domestic space. And when Via Kenwin, while Via Kenwin does set itself up, I think, with similarly dramatically framed perspectives, which domesticate Lake Geneva's own overpowering landscape, I argue that it changes this relationship in a very important way. The house is a very clear color motif, one of whose primary features is his use of the red color to trace Kenwin's boundaries. In the case of this large main space, the studio, there's a structural red column that marks the corner of the space and pierces the corner of the space from both the inside and the outside. You can see it clearly from the street. And in the case of it framing views of the lake and mountains, this is not the sort of unidirectional leasing of nature that Le Corbusier describes. As the eye passes the boundary for the view, I think color brings the eye back to the line into recognition and reinforcement of the limit. So the extent to which Kenwin domesticates the view, it does so while also drawing attention to itself as a limit, to its participation and complicity in producing the view. It points to the reliance of its own identity on what is excluded by its boundaries. So in the same gesture that creates its relationship to the perspectives it makes, Kenwin acknowledges its own self-domestication. Even though it was not an explicit intent of the building to formally convey queerness, to me, this quality points to a queer architectural aesthetic that acknowledges and celebrates an importance of relationality over a myth of fixed identity. So to end and to summarize, in this presentation, I've mostly highlighted what I consider the positive elements of Via Kenwin, but I think it would be a shallow analysis and maybe not as useful for thinking about the home's possible relevance today if I didn't mention some of its weaknesses. So what Via Kenwin models well, I think, are designing for families that are more inclusive or varied in structure and accounting for relational conditions such as they are, rather than fitting them into normative models. Second, the creation of communities of labor that support women and queer people. Third, this consideration of non-human species within networks of kinship. And fourth, formal explorations. In this case, primarily, I've told that story through the use of color, that can draw attention to the importance of relationality rather than a fixed identity. And in terms of some of the building's faults, organized symmetrically, Perdita says that she wasn't happy as a child in this world of adults, and she was raised more by hired help than by her parents, which I think is worth mentioning. And after HD, Breyer had a long affair with a woman who was also hired. So in both cases, I think what might be considered liberatory in a sense of queer kinship ends up reinstating pretty normative extractive relationships based on class. In terms of labor, to justify their value as workers, they sacrifice the heart of the home to the concerns of labor. And surely, I think we can imagine worlds in which lives are valued inherently rather than transactionally. Third, in terms of their animals, I think the horizon of non-human kinship must exceed the imaginary of domestication. And finally, in terms of architectural form, I might just reference something like Sergio Ferro's essay, Concrete as Weapon, to say that the rationalist or functionalist aesthetics of the home result in construction techniques that have been means of destroying class power adhered in craft traditions, consolidating it instead in the centralized figure of the architect, which is all super brief summation, but I'm excited for the conversation and hope I haven't gone over time. Great, thanks very much.
Okay. Haben wir noch einen zweiten? Okay, thank you very much, both SE and Sergio, for your kind of inspiring lectures. Due to the lack of time, we kind of a bit of overtime. I suggest we immediately start the discussion. So I prepared some questions, but I think it's also a small group. So are there any questions to SE or Sergio?
Yeah, Nico Weiss, my name. I'm an architect in Salzburg. I was wondering if you could unpack that floor plan for us a little bit more in detail, especially the upper floor, because it's in the 30s. It's an extremely unusual floor plan. You kind of glossed over it. I was just curious whether you could maybe, can we see it again or? No. So we have a series of 3 or 4 bedrooms, right? And you could enter actually the sanitary facilities were in between the bedrooms and you could enter them from both sides. So actually the meeting took place not in the bedroom, but in the bathrooms.
Yeah, correct. And there was also a really large open air walkway on the Lake Geneva side. Yeah. And what I was trying to call attention to was that they were all basically the same size. I mean, they were all very similar in size. There was no sort of, what might be considered a main bedroom. And to me, that kind of spoke to the expectation that this was a space in which, equals or there was some sort of egalitarian value that was expected from the space. Does that help? No.
Yeah. Was there assigned a person to each of these bedrooms, or did they was it fluid, or?
It's hard. I don't know for certain, no. But I think there was nothing that would distinguish. I mean, Breyer was the only one who lived here her entire life. She died there in the 80s. HD moved to somewhere else in Switzerland, and McPherson came to the US. But there was no room that looked larger or that looked better outfitted. So there was no room that looked as though it was specifically for Breyer rather than somebody else.
Hi, I'm Jack Halberstam. Thanks to both of you for these stunning presentations. First question, just to follow up on the last question, is about the house via Kenwin, yeah, Kenneth. They didn't build this house, so they inherited the house. Is that correct, Sergio?
They built it.
They built it.
Sorry,
I thought it was a marriage gift.
Breyer's father gave them the money to build it.
And so who designed it?
It was I'm not sure where the sketch came from, Alberto Sartoris. Ferensky really took it on, developed that sketch into a completed home. But it was in constant consultation with.
Okay, so they designed.
McPherson. They designed it.
This structure, and at the beginning you said something about the color, but we only ever really saw red. Mm-hmm. Is that the color that the Swiss neighbors just couldn't deal with, even though they all have little red roofs and Heidi, homes that are exactly that color scheme? Something about that didn't make sense, and I'll let you answer that, and then I just would love to hear you guys talk about the politics of polyamory, because as you hinted, Sergio, there's a high degree of class privilege that manages to fund this lifestyle, the mobility, the inheritance of a home, the designing, the, you know, all of these structures are require a lot of funding, let's say. But on the other hand, Essie, in your fascinating story, there's a sense that we're thinking about socialism and polyamory together. So I just want to get at the political undercurrents of polyamory, and I can definitely see what, you know, that socialism with a particular critique of ownership might lend itself politically to polyamory, but I didn't hear you talk about that.
Thank you so much for these questions. Sergio, can I start with the question of socialism and polyamory?
Please.
Yes.
And I also wanted to say hello to everyone. I see a lot of really wonderful people in the audience, so just that. Yeah, thank you so much for this question. So one of the things that actually in our group as we tested kind of these two presentations is kind of perhaps useful for the discussion is a larger question around polyamory. And obviously, you know, in my presentation, it's kind of like a retroactive framing, let's say, with me asking the gallerist, you know, would you call this polyamory? And we could even discuss, you know, from the contemporary framing, is that even a useful term? And in the presentation, I do a kind of cop-out where, you know, it's a stand-in for actually perhaps more than that, and actually relationships that go in many directions where that term isn't quite useful. But one thing that I will say, and I think that's what I want to develop now more in the paper, is the historical material. And so especially the group was very interested in the writing of Wilhelm Reich at the time, especially Ernst Fischer really was deep in that type of literature. And so they had kind of absorbed these ideas of kind of working against the bourgeois family, which also, and this is kind of important, included ideas of children being part of larger networks and not really like coupled to their parents. In addition to this, I would also say that Herbert Eichholzer specifically had spent some time in the Soviet Union in the late 1920s and had absorbed a lot of the writing of Alexander Kollontai. So there's really a deep engagement with different ideas of socialist and communist writing, let's say, of the period. And they're a group for, you know, a rural Austrian group. They're kind of early in actually thinking about different positions around family, sexuality in the kind of socialist and communist context, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean, how will I respond to that? I mean, I think wealth was definitely one of the major blinders. And it, like their film Borderline, for example, they were really trying to explore issues of race. And Essie Robeson said that she and her husband Paul would laugh themselves until they were crying, ruining their makeup by how little they kind of understood the issues of race. And I think that there was a kind of expectation, well, like, what if there was a kind of expectation of universality. They were like, why can't everyone, you know, act like a rich white person in the world, right? Like, wouldn't we all be on an equal playing field? So it was entirely a blind spot. And I might also just say that, interestingly, Hermann Henselmann became the architect later for East Berlin, and I think really had to defend himself against having built this like extremely bourgeois house, but said that like, oh, well, they have extremely socialist values. Like, they're rich, but they have very good values. Yeah.
If I may ask a question, thank you, Essie and Sergio, for your very interesting presentations. I guess my question is informed by, Essie, your very important work on Schütte-Lihotzky. Could you guys tell me more about the kitchens? So how in both villas, right? So how do the kitchens look, and who was responsible for domestic labor, and just maybe like, because maybe with reference to some of the revolutionary ideas that were kind of in circulation about the design of kitchens and the whole discourse on the liberation of women that surrounded these designs.
Thank you so much, Dahyun, for this question. I'll kind of try to keep it brief. Really, if I understand correctly, you're really asking about who did the domestic labor in Brenning, like what kind of undergirded this group, how was labor deferred? So I think maybe also going back to the previous question and the question of class in the group, which I think is a really important one, is the period I'm looking at. Maybe I'll start there. From the mid-1920s to the end of the Second World War, although we didn't talk about this as much today, is one where all of the people involved in this group experience persecution, with the exception of one internment, and some of them are killed. And I start my answer to this question in this way because both the Feuerlöscher estate and the Kastner and Oehler family, by the way, Franz Oehler was not affiliated with the Communist Party, but really funded many of the exile missions of the Communist Party of Austria for the whole of Eastern Europe. So I think what I want to say is that it's very difficult. These people all start from a lot of class privilege, but basically the world is closing down on them. And really with the last resources, they're still trying to keep communist operations, resistance operations going. So I think I want to say there's really a shift, not only downward persecution, but the total loss of the economic basis of all of these people. But it is true that obviously in the Feuerlöscher estate, there were always a lot of laborers. The factory had many dozen factory workers. The people would usually eat, there was a communal meal for the factory workers. And then there was, of course, in the main house where the family lived, there was a big communal kitchen. It's still there. You can actually look at it in rural Styria. But that was also obviously there was household personnel. So it's difficult. I think I do think there needs to be an acknowledgement of the class privilege of the group. But the period I'm looking at is one where all of this becomes completely destabilized, if that makes sense.
And Kenwin, that's a great question. The kitchen is to the side and less well appointed, and I have no direct evidence, but I think there was an apartment for a domestic laborer in the basement, so I really think that someone was cooking for them. I did, though, in Breyer's archive find a recipe for cocktails, so I think they were making their own drinks, if that counts. But I think that's probably the extent of it.
Okay, maybe that's our kind of keyword to kind of go in a refreshment break. Maybe not a cocktail yet. Thank you so much, SE and Sergio, for your contributions to our things. And we have a 5 minutes refreshment break, and then we go to the next panel, the second one on design. Thank you very much.
Thanks, SE.
Sophie, du hast gar nichts fragen können. Tschüss.